This is BBC News, and these are the top stories developing at midday. Anger in the White House. Donald Trump's lawyers threaten legal action against his former chief of staff, Steve Bannon, over explosive claims in a new book. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair rejects allegations in the book that he warned Donald Trump's aides UK intelligence may have spied on him. The Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, promises farmers they'll get the same level of subsidies for 5 years post-Brexit, but warns the current system doesn't reward efficiency.
Well, we've guaranteed that in cash terms, the amount of money that we give to farmers will remain exactly the same right up until the next general election in 2022. And what we want to do is to ensure that thereafter, that there is a smooth path towards a different form of paying farmers.
Record numbers of people called the NHS 111 helpline during the festive period, and there was an increase in ambulances being delayed outside A&E. Tech firms work to fix a flaw in computer chips that could allow hackers to steal personal data from computers and smartphones. A warning that schools should play a bigger role in preparing children for social media's emotional demands as they move to secondary school. The leader of the council in Windsor calls for police to take action against what he called aggressive begging before the royal wedding in May. And Britain's Andy Murray withdraws from the Australian Open after failing to recover from an ongoing hip injury. Hello, a very good afternoon to you. It's what date is it? It is the 4th of January, isn't it? I'm Anita McVeigh and welcome to BBC Newsroom Live. Donald Trump's lawyers have threatened his former chief of staff, Steve Bannon, with legal action for speaking about his time on the election campaign to the author of a book about the president. The book by the journalist Michael Wolff makes bold claims, including that Donald Trump was unprepared for the job and that his wife, Melania, cried when he won the race to the White House. Mr. Bannon was quoted as describing the president's son, Donald Jr., as treasonous and unpatriotic for meeting Russians during the campaign. Mr. Trump hit back, accusing his former strategist of losing his mind after he lost his job at the White House. Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes reports.
They were once as thick as thieves. Steve Bannon helped shape the America First campaign that got Donald Trump elected president. In the White House, he was a key player. He had the president's ear. But his job as chief strategist was short-lived, and Mr. Bannon returned to his role as the head of the right-wing Breitbart News website. He promised to be the president's wingman outside, but this book reveals a different story. The most damaging claim is that Steve Bannon viewed a meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and a group of Russians during the presidential campaign as treasonous and unpatriotic. Also present were Mr. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his then campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. The three senior guys in the campaign thought it was a good idea to meet with a foreign government inside Trump Tower in the conference room on the 25th floor with no lawyers, Bannon is quoted as saying. He adds that after the meeting they should have called the FBI immediately. The president has hit back in a scathing statement. He says, Steve Bannon has nothing to do with me or my presidency. When he was fired, he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. He goes on, Steve was rarely in a one-on-one meeting with me and only pretends to have had influence to fool a few people with no access and no clue, whom he helped write phony books. The White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders has condemned the book's contents as completely untrue. She says the meeting was not an act of treason.
I think that is a ridiculous accusation and one that I'm pretty sure we've addressed many times from here before. And if that's in reference to comments made by Mr. Bannon, I'd refer you back to the ones that he made previously on 60 Minutes, where he called the collusion with Russia about this president a total farce. So I think I would look back at that. If anybody's been inconsistent, it's been him. Certainly hasn't been the president or this administration.
The book also includes the claim that Steve Bannon believed the Russians were taken after the meeting to meet Donald Trump. The president has always denied that happened. With the ongoing investigation into possible Russian collusion in the presidential election, this explosive row between Donald Trump and his once trusted ally has left Washington stunned. Peter Bowes, BBC News.
And there are more revelations in the book. Wolf describes the amazement and dismay in the Trump camp at his November 2016 election win. He says a befuddled Trump morphing into a disbelieving Trump and then into a horrified Trump. Suddenly, Donald Trump became a man who believed that he deserved to be president. Michael Wolff also claims that Trump didn't enjoy his own inauguration. He was angry that A-level stars had snubbed the event, the book claims, and visibly fought with his wife, who seemed on the verge of tears. The First Lady's office rejects this claim, saying that Mrs. Trump supported her husband's bid for president and was happy when he won. The book also purports to lift the lid on Trump's daughter Ivanka's secret presidential ambitions. It says that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Ivanka decided to accept roles in the West Wing over the advice of almost everyone they knew. And that, if sometime in the future the opportunity arose, she, Ivanka, would be the one to run for president. Other claims in the book that Tony Blair warned Donald Trump's aides that UK intelligence may have spied on him and that Blair was angling for a post-election Middle East advisor role have been dismissed as categorically absurd by the former Prime Minister. He's been speaking to the BBC.
This story, as we had pointed out, is a complete fabrication. I mean, literally from beginning to end. I've never had such conversation in the White House, outside of the White House, with Jared Kushner, with anybody else.
You ever met Jared Kushner?
Of course I've met him, and we discussed the Middle East peace process. And by the way, that part of the story is also untrue. I mean, I wasn't sort of angling for some job.
You don't want a job?
No, I did the quartet role. I'm still very active on the Middle East peace process, but I've got absolutely no desire for an official position. I never sought one, was never offered one, don't want one. But the story, I mean, it's a sort of reflection, though, to me on the crazy state of modern politics. I mean, here's a story that's literally an invention and is now halfway around the world with conspiracy
all the way
theories.
around the world.
Yeah, no, conspiracy theories attached to it. But anyway, there you go. That's modern politics.
And joining me now to look into this is Leslie Vinjamuri, Associate Professor at SOAS, University of London, and Associate Fellow of the US and the Americas Programme at the independent international affairs think tank Chatham House. Leslie, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
So are these the words of a disgruntled former chief of staff, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think undoubtedly it's both, right? It's certainly Bannon's trying to stoke the fires. But undoubtedly, there's more to it. But I think the real problem here is that this is a president. Donald Trump has come back 2018 and really needs to drive forward with a very strategic agenda. And what we've seen in the last few days are 16 or 17 tweets in his first day and a half back on a number of issues, very inflammatory. And now this comes out. And of course, we've even heard that there might be a lawsuit against the author of the book, Wolff, for failing to abide to a number of confidentiality agreements for Bannon's conversation. So there is a question of, is this going to take this president right back down into the weeds? Bannon's been a concern since he left the White House. There was a lot of concern about whether he would actually be more of a problem outside of the White House than in. And of course, the loss of the Senate seat, the election in Alabama, was attributed in part to Trump listening to Bannon. And so this break has been coming now for several weeks. But this is really very significant in the sense that it's going to distract this president very markedly. And of course, the really big story coming out of the book, I think, is that Bannon has said the Russia investigations are very seriously. He's used the word treason, I think.
Yes.
So that I think is something that's going to prove problematic for the White House.
How do you think this specific comment on Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting, calling it treasonous, how do you think that is going to feed into the wider investigation into these allegations of collusion between Russia and the Trump presidential campaign?
Well, I think it gives fuel to those who want to see the investigations proceed. Remember, the president's been hoping that the investigations would come to a close. It's pretty clear, especially since we got the news that the former national security advisor seems to be cooperating, that wasn't going to happen. Nonetheless, I think the president was hoping that he could sort of tie a bow on these investigations. But now we have Bannon, who was very close to Trump, saying, there's a real problem here. So the sort of, the conversation around those investigations is not going to go away. And it proves to be a very serious distraction for a president who just about got tax through. It's not been popular, hasn't made any headway with his broader legislative agenda on infrastructure, is facing some very, very serious national security problems, North Korea. And these Russia investigations are now just going to continue to distract him.
And just a final thought, in many ways, it's not surprising, is it? Because, these latest revelations from Steve Bannon, it's very symptomatic of the White House since Trump became president. It's been a chaotic White House. It's been one where he has very publicly clashed with people who one day he's calling, a great guy, and the next is pushing out the door.
That's right. We've seen ongoing dysfunctionality. There was a hope in that moment when John Kelly came in that he would be able to bring some order to the White House. And I think for people outside America who are trying to understand how does one deal with this White House, it's very disturbing because there's been one question has been, do we follow the tweets or do we follow the policy? Now it's, can this White House and the broader administration make policy? Or is it going to continue to just be very dysfunctional? It's a bit of a soap opera going on in Washington, but at a time when there are some really very serious issues, both at home and abroad.
OK, Leslie, thank you very much for your thoughts today. Leslie Vinjamuri.
Thank you.
The Environment Secretary has set out his plans for what he calls a green Brexit. Michael Gove said the government will mirror EU subsidies to British farmers worth £3 billion a year until 2024. The payments will then be replaced by a system to encourage environmental improvements, such as rewards for opening up the countryside to the public, providing new habitats for wildlife and increasing biodiversity.
Of course, Brexit will mean change. But critically, what it means most of all is that we can once more decide how we shape change and how we meet the challenges ahead. It means we don't need any longer to follow the path dictated by the Common Agricultural Policy. We can have our own national food policy, our own agriculture policy, our own environment policies, our own economic policies, shaped by our own collective interests.
Michael Gove. Well, let's talk to our political correspondent, Chris Mason at Westminster, about all of this. Chris, is a special case being made for farmers in that the payments they currently get will be mirrored for 5 years post-Brexit in a way that in other areas it won't happen?
I think there's an acute awareness, Anita, that farmers are particularly affected by Brexit because the Common Agricultural Policy, which has been around for many, many decades and is such a big part of the European Union, still around 40% of EU payments are via the Common Agricultural Policy. It used to be much, much higher in decades past. So, in other words, farmers will be very conscious of what's going to happen after Brexit because payments from the EU make up a big proportion of their income and their balance sheets now. Just a couple of statistics for you. More than half of the money that comes from the EU to the UK goes on agriculture. In 2016, that was about £2.7 billion. In the UK, there are 178,000 recipients of CAP payments. The average amount per beneficiary being between £17,000 and £18,000. Now, what we did know prior to today was that the government had said that for the 2 years that is expected to be the window of a transition period after March 2019, so after Brexit has formally happened, that things would remain the same. What we've learnt today is that in England, for most farmers, things will continue the same beyond that for a further 3 years until 2024. Here is Mr. Gove spelling that out. He uses a little bit of jargon. He talks about the BPS here. That is the Basic Payment Scheme, which is the biggest of the EU's rural payments.
I then envisage guaranteeing that BPS payments continue for a transition period in England, which should last a number of years beyond the implementation period, depending on consultation. During these years, we propose to first reduce the largest BPS payments in England. We could do this through a straight cap at a maximum level or through a sliding scale of reductions to the largest payments first.
So what sort of reaction has there been from farmers to this, Chris?
Broadly positive reaction from farmers to this, who are obviously concerned about what would happen in a relatively short number of years time. So from that perspective, there is some reassurance, although there'll still be a relatively narrow window for them to adjust to the new system. And however much the frustrations that many farmers have had with the Common Agricultural Policy, and there have been plenty, the new system that Mr Gove is proposing will be, in all likelihood, pretty different. He wants to make a virtue of, to use the slogan, taking back control, to design a system of rural payments that are channelled from the government here at Westminster to farms around England in a way that better reflects the agricultural industry in England. And just to nod to the situation elsewhere in the UK, the view from the government when they look at the practicalities of delivering Brexit is that during the transition period, the 2 years from March 2019 until March 2021, roughly, because that transition period hasn't been negotiated yet, things will effectively carry on just the same, because in all likelihood the money will still be coming from Europe, even though we'll be no longer a member of the European Union, because the transition period will keep pretty much everything the same. Beyond that, the 3 years that Mr Gove was talking about this morning, agriculture being a devolved issue will be something sorted out in Edinburgh and in Cardiff and in Belfast, and so it is possible that administrations there follow a different policy from the English model. So that's why what Mr Gove is saying from 2021 to 2024 is talking about England only. Let me just insert one more caveat into an already complicated picture here, Anita. Of course, Mr Gove is therefore talking about a period, at least some of which, is beyond the next general election. So he's effectively talking about Conservative policy rather than government policy, because who knows who'll be in government here at Westminster the other side of that next election.
And that is a very good question. Chris, thank you very much. Chris Mason at Westminster. Now, there's a warning that some low-paid jobs, including cashiers and shop assistants, could be replaced by machines or computers if the minimum wage continues to increase. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has found that jobs which are easier to automate could soon disappear altogether as artificial intelligence increasingly dominates our lives and employers consider machines cheaper in the long term than humans. Well, let's get more insight into this story with Jonathan Cribb, who's a senior economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which of course is behind this report. Jonathan, welcome. What sort of time frame are you talking about?
So what we've done is we've looked at a measure of how routine jobs are. The more routine jobs are, the more that they are likely to be able to be replaced by machinery. And we're really talking about technology now, not even thinking about the more complex technology that might be coming forward in the future. And what we see is that if we look at where the minimum wage is now compared to where the minimum wage was only 2 or 3 years ago, the jobs affected by the minimum wage are much more likely to be able to be automated than they were only a few years ago.
So we already see that in some shops that we go into. There might be one member of staff supervising self-service tills, for example, but clearly replacing several tills where you would have had people standing behind them not that long ago. So the technology exists, you're saying, to do that on a wider scale already?
In general, technology exists that are able to replace jobs that have fixed limits, very fixed rules and patterns, or things that involve kind of finger dexterity. Actually, some jobs that are relatively routine and relatively automatable, therefore, are kind of middle pay, such as bank clerks. So those could be things that are in the future subject to automation.
The irony of this, of course, is that this could put people out of work, but actually increase productivity, couldn't it?
So the design of a higher minimum wage would be to boost the earnings and incomes of low paid people in work. However, if we raise it so high that firms increasingly have an incentive to use machines rather than people, then that could have a deleterious effect on these people's living standards.
So actually that might not improve productivity if they don't have the wages to go out and spend money then. Is that what you're saying?
It's not clear. We would think that better technology in general would increase the productivity of workers. What would be worrying is if this higher productivity for some workers isn't also experienced by the low-skilled people, and if they're kind of priced out of the labour market by a higher minimum wage.
OK, it's a fascinating topic. Jonathan, thank you very much for talking to us. Jonathan Cribb from the IFS. The headlines now on BBC Newsroom Live. The time is 19 minutes past 12. Anger in the White House. Donald Trump's lawyers threaten legal action against his former chief of staff, Steve Bannon, over claims in a new book on the president. The Environment Secretary Michael Gove has set out how the regulations governing food and farming will change after Brexit. Record numbers of people called the NHS 111 helpline during the festive period, and there was an increase in ambulances being delayed outside A&E. Time for some more sport. Let's head to Jessica at the BBC Sports Centre. Hi, Jessica.
Good afternoon to you, Anita. We'll start with tennis because Andy Murray has pulled out of the first Grand Slam of the tennis season, the Australian Open, and says he's not yet ready to compete. Murray will fly home from Australia back to the UK to concentrate on rehabilitation for a long-term hip injury. That's ruled him out of playing competitively for the last 6 months. Here's our tennis correspondent, Russell Fuller.
Hey, Jessica, thank you very much. More now on one of our top stories today. Record numbers of people called the non-emergency NHS 111 helpline over the Christmas week. The pressures facing the health service are also highlighted by a sharp increase in ambulances being delayed outside A&E. The data released by NHS England shows more than 480,000 people called NHS 111. That's a 21% rise in calls to the non-emergency helpline during the last week of Christmas compared to the previous week. Ambulance crews faced delays of over 30 minutes handing over patients to A&E staff nearly 17,000 times during that last week of December. And at least 20 hospital trusts have now been forced to declare major incidents this week. That's nearly 1 in 8 of the total. Our health correspondent Nick Triggle is here. So what does this information tell us beyond the obvious winter pressures that we've already been hearing about, of course?
Well, it's a sign of just how busy A&E units are. Ambulances that arrive should be able to hand over their patients to doctors and nurses at A&E within 15 minutes of arrival, but clearly that's not happening in many cases. I've been speaking to ambulance crews who say they've been forced to take their patients into hospital corridors and wait and nurse them until staff comes free, and sometimes those delays are up to 5 or 6 hours, and that delays them
5 or 6 hours?
Yeah, some of the extreme ones are for that long, and that delays them getting out into the community, responding to other 999 calls. And we've seen ambulance trusts this week also declaring major incidents, not just the hospitals but the ambulance trusts, and they've had to resort to things such as asking those less serious cases to perhaps arrange their own transport to hospital. So it is clear there are some severe pressures in the early weeks of this new year.
We've just had a quote from Theresa May apologising for delays to NHS operations, saying she knows it's difficult, frustrating and disappointing. Number 10, of course, wants to project the image that the Prime Minister empathises with the position that lots of people who have had procedures cancelled or postponed with the position that they are in. But lots of people are therefore asking, well, if you know that there's going to be a peak at this time of year in demand, why don't you put more resources into the NHS?
Well, the ministers are right. There's been a lot more planning has gone into this winter than previous winters, and the move to cancel operations is about easing the pressure and to avoid those last-minute cancellations that have happened in previous winters. Now, what has previously happened is the NHS has had a busy couple of weeks, and whilst it's difficult, the NHS is able to cope. But what will be crucial this time round is if the pressures do not ease in the next couple of weeks. If we have a bad flu outbreak, for example, that could put the NHS under severe strain. So much depends on what happens these next few weeks.
Flu figures out this afternoon, is that right, Nick?
Flu figures are out at 2. It's been so far pretty low levels of flu, but there are reports that there's a lot of respiratory illness in A&E departments at the moment.
OK, Nick, thank you very much. Nick Triggle. A council leader has written an open letter calling for action to tackle what he describes as aggressive begging on the streets of Windsor. The letter, written by Councillor Simon Dudley, comes ahead of the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, which is taking place in May. The Windsor Homeless Project described the comments as abhorrent. Our correspondent Adina Campbell has been gauging reaction in Windsor.
This has proved to be very controversial, of course, just 4 months until Prince Harry marries Meghan Markle here at Windsor Castle behind me. In this 3-page letter, the leader of Windsor and Maidenhead Borough Council, that's Royal Borough Council, has written to the Thames Valley Police Crime Commissioner, that's Anthony Stansfeld, setting out his concerns about the level of homelessness and begging in this borough, saying that they should be using their legal powers to remove the number of homeless people here ahead of the wedding. He's called this aggressive begging, intimidating behaviour, and saying that homelessness is completely unacceptable. But of course, as you can imagine, this has caused anger and upset amongst the homeless charities in this area, who've called his comments abhorrent, even have gone as far to say that his comments are sickening, saying that he's used the royal wedding as an excuse to target these vulnerable people. Now, tens of thousands of people are expected to join in the celebrations on May the 19th when Prince Harry marries Meghan Markle here at St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. But of course, a bit like the weather, this letter has caused a dark shadow ahead of the upcoming celebrations.
And, you know, he talks about people begging and choosing to be homeless and saying that they have been offered accommodation that they've turned down or other assistance that they've turned down. What evidence is there that that is the case?
Well, in his letter, Simon Dudley does say that the council has invested heavily in these support services to help some of the 50 or 60 approximately rough sleepers in Windsor, saying that the support is there. But he goes as far to say that they've chosen not to engage and not to take up that support, which has been rejected by some of the charities here in this area, who say it's not out of choice that they want to be homeless. That's just the situation they're in. And some of the people we've spoken to this morning, some of the people from these charities, say that it's completely outrageous that he's trying to remove these people who are in such a vulnerable situation, saying that they should be just cleared out because of this high-profile royal wedding. As I say, tens of thousands of people are expected to visit on May the 19th to see Meghan Markle marry Prince Harry, but some people have said that these comments are unacceptable, not just for the residents here, but for the millions of people who do visit Windsor every year to see sights like this.
Adina Campbell reporting. It's time now for the weather forecast, and Darren Bett is here with us this hour with the latest. Hi, Darren.